Dead Cells is one of the most popular roguelites of all time, and I consider it one of my top 5 roguelites. It can be punishing, but it has incredibly smooth and enjoyable gameplay. So let's get into it. Dead Cells is a punishing platformer roguelite with incredibly responsive gameplay that hooked me from the very first run. You fight your way through a series of biomes, which are areas or levels that have their own unique themes and enemies. You can choose your path on the way up and explore the different biomes, and there are some Metroidvania elements where you have to unlock certain powers by beating bosses in order to get access to certain areas. It's a heavily progression-focused roguelite, which I'll talk about later in the progression section. In terms of skills and weapons, you have 2 weapons and 2 items at once, and there's also a dodge roll that you can use throughout the game. You can level up these weapons throughout your run, and each weapon or item comes with various stats, such as plus 40% damage to frozen enemies or enemies explode when they die, which can lead to some unique combinations and interactions between 3 different items and weapons that you have. There are also 3 main weapon types, so you have melee weapons, you have shields, and you have ranged weapons or bows. And there are a large number of items in the game as well, from deployable turrets to grenades to ground traps, and really just a lot of different things. You can also get long-term buffs in the form of stat buffs, which give you increased health and buff items or weapons that use that particular stat. And you can also get mutations, which are buffs that give your character certain bonuses, such as healing after killing an enemy. Together, these make the game really fluid, and they really allow you to experiment with different synergies and combinations as you run through the game. Dead Cells is also definitely a challenging game, and it's marketed as a Souls-lite, and it's also my favorite Souls-lite that I've ever played, since I generally have such mixed feelings about the genre. One thing that Dead Cells does differently than a lot of other Souls-like games is that it has scalable difficulty, which I'll talk about more in the progression section. While the game is known for being punishing, and it definitely is, it also allows for players who are just worse at the game to still have fun by playing at the lower difficulty levels. You don't need to climb difficulty ranks if you don't want to. One thing that goes along with this challenging nature is some playstyle limitations. So if you only want to play at the lower levels, you can kind of play however you want, do what's fun for you. But if you do want to play at the higher levels, you kind of need to fit a certain playstyle, which is the never get hit playstyle. There's no real tanking in Dead Cells, and as you climb the difficulty ranks, you get access to less and less healing, which makes every hit last longer, so to speak. This also makes it so you almost always need a shield to parry, and therefore makes bows and ranged weapons less useful. If you want to go far, you'll need to learn to time your parries and dodges very well. You'll need to learn the enemy movesets in order to do that. You also get bonus loot after each level if you get a certain kill streak without taking damage, which also adds to the advantage of the no-hit playstyle. But again, if you only want to play at the lower difficulty levels, it's totally beatable with whatever weapon, whatever build that you want to use. Also, needing to time these dodges and parries means that it's a very mechanical game. You need quick reaction times and stuff like that. For me, this also meant that if you take a break and come back to Dead Cells like I did, you lose a lot of your skills in a way that you don't with games like Slay the Spire, that I found were much easier to put down and come back to later. The final thing that I'll say that's not exactly gameplay, but the devs are super responsive and active in this game even 2 years after its full release. They release new updates to the game constantly, and some of them are actually pretty substantial. So, for example, they released an update recently where they released a whole new biome, which again is a new area to fight through, and they've historically added new bosses' weapons that are all completely free with the base game. They're also weirdly active, in a good way, in the balance of the game, which I feel is incredibly rare for single-player games like this. I like to talk about RNG and randomness in roguelites because procedural generation is a key piece of the genre. So how is the RNG in Dead Cells? I think it's generally good. In terms of map layout, I never felt like I was hampered by RNG. It will decide certain things like which biome you find first or how quickly you come across the stat buffs, but each area has a set number of stat buffs that you'll find. You can always find the exits to the same areas in each biome. And once you've unlocked them all, you can always choose which area to go to next. You always know what enemies you'll find in a certain biome, even if you don't know exactly where they will be. I will say there are occasional kind of gotcha map layouts. So for example, you'll find spikes at the bottom of a drop that you just can't predict. But things like that are incredibly rare, and they don't really hamper your run that much. Probably the most significant RNG in the game is what weapons and items you get on a particular run and what their stats are. So you actually run across a lot of weapons during each run, and you see a lot of merchants where you can buy weapons as well. So this RNG is counteracted by, just having so many chances to get what kind of weapon you want to get good stats. You can also take some risks to get better items with things like the curse chests. Basically, it gives you better loot, but if you get hit before killing a certain number of enemies, you'll die, you'll lose your run. So while there is this RNG with weapons you get, I found that there were sufficient sort of countermeasures to the RNG, sufficient ways to feel like you aren't getting screwed by not getting the right weapon. But there are also some weird consequences to how the loot pool works. So basically, as you unlock more weapons, you just get added to this larger pool of items, which means that you get a smaller and smaller chance of getting any particular item that you want. And as I talked about earlier, there are mainly melee weapons, bows, or ranged weapons, and shields. Shields generally allow you to get further if you can time your parries correctly. So if you want a melee weapon and a shield each run, as I did, that's how I usually play it, it makes sense to never unlock the bows so they don't mess up your RNG. So it kind of incentivized a weird mechanic where I barely unlocked any bows because I wanted to use shields and melee weapons instead, which I don't think is what the devs intended. And it's kind of a shame because I wanted to try these bows, I wanted to try these weapons, but I didn't want to dilute my loot pool by having these weapons in there that I didn't want to use just because I wanted to try them once. Finally, in terms of weapon stats, as I mentioned earlier, they had these unique combos between each other that can add a lot of freshness to the game with their interactions with your other weapons and items in your kit. So for example, you can combo items with increased damage to burning enemies with, a burning weapon. Sort of you have that synergy there that you can try, and that can be a fun element of Dead Cells. You can also re-roll the stats for each item for a cost, so there is some RNG mitigation there. I will say though, some stats are just strictly better than others, combos aside, so the RNG can definitely help you there or hurt you there. So as a whole, I would say the RNG in Dead Cells provides some freshness, which is what you want, but it can also be a little annoying or, particularly helpful with what weapons and what items you get on a given run. I don't think it ever fully decides a run for you, but it can definitely make it much easier or much harder if you're forced to use a weapon you hate or something like that. So there are two forms of progression that I like to talk about, and Dead Cells has a good amount of both. It's a very progression-focused roguelite. So one form of progression is horizontal progression, which is progression that changes the gameplay without changing the difficulty of the game. And the other is vertical progression, which is progression that does change the difficulty of the game by making it easier or harder in some way. The biggest forms of horizontal progression in Dead Cells are the different biomes, different mini-bosses, and the different weapons and items that you come across in your runs. In terms of the biomes, I found that they had a really good amount of variety. They have different themes to them, they have different enemies and stuff, although there are some enemies that you see across different biomes. There are also many different paths you can take to get to the final boss, so each run can be different if you want it to be. It's a branching choice, which is great, because you can always choose to avoid certain areas if you hate them, or you can choose to go to new areas if you want some more variety, if you want some more freshness in your game. I actually cleared the boss on the lowest difficulty without having even gone to like half the biomes. So seeing them all is definitely something that requires some seeking out, and it also requires unlocking some of the powers, as I mentioned earlier, which is a little Metroidvania element. Dead Cells also has an insane number of unlocks. This means that every run you can level up new things, get new weapons, new items, new mutations, or even new skins for your character. Most of the items, mutations, and weapons merely add more gameplay variety, but some of them do feel just strictly better than others, which brings me to the vertical progression, or progression that does change the difficulty of the game in some way. In addition to these weapon unlocks, there are also some account-wide buffs, such as buffs that increase the rarity of the items that you find, or you can level up your health potions so that you can get more uses out of it. Honestly, it felt like almost too much vertical progression. You have to play a ton to max out the rarity increase boosts, which, is a boost that makes all your runs easier, and many items and weapons are locked behind higher difficulties. This is because the game wants to give you some more progression as you keep playing through the game, as you keep climbing the difficulty ranks. But it also means you can't even use all the weapons for the game for quite a long time, and it makes you feel like you need to grind the game out a bit in order to level things up so you can actually beat the game. So you kind of need more than one health potion use in order to beat the game. Or at least it's much easier if you can use your health potion, 4 times versus once. And there are a lot of roguelites out there that have some necessary grind, and for just the basics like health potion, it isn't awful, but if you want all of the important account-wide buffs, it does take a pretty long time, and it can be off-putting to have to grind so much in a roguelite. But the other biggest form of vertical progression is the difficulty levels. So when I first played Dead Cells, I didn't realize there were difficulty levels, and I beat it in around 5 hours for my first clear, which really surprised me because I had heard that the game was so difficult. But then I realized I was just playing on the lowest difficulty level, and there are actually 6 different difficulty levels, each of which adds new enemies to each biome, new weapons to unlock, and the highest difficulty level even adds new areas and new bosses. Beating the higher difficulty levels is insanely difficult, and some people will play for hundreds or even thousands of hours in order to do so. I'll probably never climb that high in the difficulty levels, but if you're interested in really sinking yourself into one game and really challenging yourself to sort of master the mechanics of the game, Dead Cells is a great game to do that, because it's really focused around that kind of progression, that kind of mastery of skills. So let's talk briefly about the narrative and story elements in Dead Cells. It's definitely not a story-driven game, and most roguelites aren't, but it does have a sprinkling of lore and story elements throughout the game. As you play through the game, some story areas will appear, and they usually have notes or other objects you can interact with. These will give hints at the cause of the malaise you've encountered through the game, and why you're fighting the monsters that you are fighting. I think these elements add some nice flavor to the settings, and they explain in a rudimentary way what you're doing, but it's very simple and it's very secondary or even tertiary to the other game elements. The story elements are also colored differently on the minimap, so they're easier to seek out if you want more of the story. You can also just turn them off in the settings if you want to avoid it completely. So now I'll briefly talk about the Bad Seed DLC. Basically, the DLC adds 2 earlier biomes, 1 new mini-boss, and some new weapons and items. I did like the new biomes, and I think the second one is particularly interesting because it adds these mini bosses within the biome that you have to fight. The new items and weapons are fun, and they do add a couple new mechanics. But as a whole, it's not a very large addition to the game. It mostly adds some horizontal progression in the form of more variety in the early game, and some more weapons and some more items to explore and try out. If you enjoy Dead Cells, the DLC is pretty cheap and worth checking out if you plan to sink a bunch of time into the game, but I don't think it's necessary for the game at all, and I'd recommend just trying the base game first if you're unsure how much you like Dead Cells in the first place. So now for my overview, summary, and verdict on Dead Cells. Is it worth buying? If you watch my video where I ranked my favorite roguelites, you'll know that Dead Cells is one of my favorite roguelites of all time. The gameplay is just super satisfying, there's a lot of gameplay variety, and the devs are still active in improving the game even years after release. There is an insane amount of progression, almost too much actually because it takes so many hours to see everything and max the account-wide buffs. That also means there's a ton of replayability, and it's a game that can be played for hundreds of hours or even longer. The game isn't for everyone, especially because it can be incredibly challenging, though I will say that the scalable difficulty means that you never have to play in the more punishing levels if you just don't want to. If you're into roguelites or challenging games, I would definitely recommend checking it out. I think it's worth it at full price, but you can also grab it for like $12 on sale. Please like this video to help me out if you found it enjoyable or informative, and I'll link some more reviews of mine in the description down below. Thanks for watching.